I'm a historian of the United States, and my research specialty is the American conservative movement. Now, I can hear what you're thinking. Gee, this must be a pretty interesting time to study conservatism. It is a fascinating time. It's a little bit of a scary time, and it's a little bit of an exciting time. It's scary because it's not usual for a historian to have her subject change underneath her. And it's exciting, though, because as it changes, it opens up a whole host of new questions, new problems, and new opportunities. So as a historian, I firmly believe that as much as the past has its own integrity and essence, it's also in many ways a dialogue with the present and a dialogue with the future. So as things change in the present, we look at the past differently, we have different conversations about where we've been, and also about where we might be going. So what I plan to do today is, first of all, tell you a little bit about how historians of the United States have understood the American conservative movement. And then I want to reflect a little bit about how changes in the current political climate have opened up new questions, new problems, and new understandings. So let me start with the beginning, which in the United States in the 20th century is the post-war era. The era after World War II, when the modern United States really comes into being. And at this moment in time, pundits, intellectuals, thinkers, wise women, wise men were all convinced of one thing. There was no conservatism in America. Here's a representative sentiment from the literary critic Lionel Trilling in a widely noted and widely applauded book of 1950, in which he asserts there really is no conservatism in America. So this was widely taken to be accurate, and what did Trilling mean, we might ask? What did Trilling and others like him mean when they said there was no conservatism? Well, many of these thinkers were envisioning conservatism as something essentially European, something that had to do with reverence for an aristocracy, for a crown, for a certain hierarchical order of society. And the thinking was, in the United States, we didn't have that. We had no God and country, no king and crown to swear fealty to. Instead, we were a liberal, individualistic nation dedicated to the pursuit of happiness, to life, liberty, and property. So we really couldn't be understood to have any type of conservative tradition in any meaningful sense. So that was the thinking. It sounded plausible. It was broadly accepted. But there was one problem. At the very moment that Trilling was writing this, there was a gathering movement of people, of students, of political activists, politicians, thinkers, ordinary men and women who were beginning to think of themselves as conservatives and were beginning to feel that conservatism was what the nation needed. So let's fast forward 10 years to this book, Conscience of a Conservative in 1960. And essentially, by 1960, it was really hard to make a Trilling-style argument. You had a nationally known politician, Barry Goldwater, who had come out and said, I'm a conservative, and moreover, here's my manifesto of what conservatism is. And it was widely read and widely discussed. So you now had a sort of template, a mission statement of what conservatism was. So what is in Goldwater's book? How and why should we think of him as a representative of conservatism? Well, I created a handy Venn diagram to help you think through. And this is what historians have called fusionist conservatism. The idea was that around mid-century, a variety of political and social and cultural impulses came together under this umbrella of conservatism. And Goldwater is a good representative of this tradition because he broadly participated in all three. He was known as an advocate of limited government and of capitalism. He was known as a staunch Cold Warrior, and he was also one to invoke the need for traditional values and traditional law and order respect in society. So if this is a sort of very broad fusion that comes together in the 60s, I think you can also think to yourself, well, how do these really broad abstract categories continue to function over time? And you can see that developments that Goldwater couldn't even have dreamed of, things like the gay rights movement or legal abortion, could really fit into the concerns of traditional religion, where even as the Cold War changed and evolved, anti-communism could come to stand in for a certain type of American role in the world and engagement in foreign policy. And you can see how the ideas of capitalism and limited government, deregulation, continue to hold purchase. So this turns out to be a synthesis that worked pretty well. Yet at the same time, you might notice these things don't necessarily go together in any organic or intuitive or natural way. And so a lot of scholarship has been dedicated to thinking about how these fit together. And I myself, as a researcher, was always a bit skeptical of this story. I wrote my first book on Ayn Rand, who was a prominent intellectual and thinker who didn't really fit into this fusionist vision, yet it was undeniable that she was important to conservatives and conservatism read by them and engaged. So my early research wrestled with this question. I'm currently writing a biography of Milton Friedman, who, like Ayn Rand, has some consonances in conservatism and also some things that are different from it. So as a researcher looking at this subject, I've always been a little bit skeptical of this story of fusionism. And I've sort of been waiting my whole career for this thing to fall apart. Nothing lasts forever. But if you had told me at any point in the past that the agent of the conservative crack-up would be Donald J. Trump, I would not have believed you. So what has happened? We are in the middle of a conservative crack-up where a political candidate was able, who was not conservative, admittedly not conservative, if you look at that Venn diagram, doesn't fit very well into it, was able to essentially take control of the preferred political apparatus of the conservative movement, the Republican Party, and then win election. And so we now have a widespread identity crisis among this movement as they think through how to respond and what to do next. So I think for historians who study this, it poses a question of what was happening in the past? And sidebar, why did this happen? That's like a whole other TED Talk. So I'll just flag two things that as a historian I point my students to when I talk about this in my final lecture in the 20th century survey class. I talk about the role of media, new forms of communication, and I also talk about the erosion of traditional party structures caused in part by those new forms of communication, but also caused in part by new ways of funding candidates and using money in politics. So those are two things I would put into the hopper here were I doing another TED Talk. But in terms of this one, I want to talk about how historians now think about conservatism. Are we still using the same fusionist model? Are we still thinking about it in the same way? And so let me go back to the Venn diagram. Does it still work for us? Well, one thing historians are noticing now instead is instead of this diagram of things coming together and working harmoniously, there's more focus on what I would call conservative purges. So we look at a figure like William F. Buckley, and we see that again and again and again, he took pains to tell certain people, certain organizations that they were not conservative and they were not allowed in his movement. An early example of that would be Ayn Rand. A lesser known example of that comes immediately out of the post-war period when Buckley essentially purged the movement of anyone who was openly anti-Semitic or isolationist, anyone who's part of what historians call the old right. And this was a long process. These were palpable forces. They were contenders for the leadership of the movement, and Buckley pushed them out. So I think now when we look back, we start to see these boundary struggles, this movement against other elements trying to come into modern conservatism. And I think we start to think more, okay, there are all these purges, but why did there have to be so many purges? Why was it so necessary to police the boundaries so carefully? So we then start to see a separate dynamic that maybe instead of three things coming together, we have a sort of push and pull between two. And then as we look at more recent history, I would say episodes once considered fringe, the running of a candidate for president who didn't seem to have much of a chance, now instead seem to be precursors. So I want to come back then to this opening quote from Trilling, that there is no conservatism in America. Because as much as it seems silly to us now, I think he was onto something, in that he was talking about the way that most political movements and impulses within America lived within a broader tradition, sometimes called the classical liberal tradition. And most American conservatives in the 20th century thought of themselves as also classical liberals, people committed to individualistic ideas, to representative government, to limited government, to the power of integrative global and transnational trade. These were part of the package. So looking really big in terms of political philosophy, there was a shared consensus that political movements operated within. That's not to underscore the very deep policy and philosophical differences between liberals and conservatives. But I think looking back now, what we are seeing is not so much a story of three contradictory impulses weaving themselves together. That's still there. But we also see a story of a conservative movement that got itself into the mainstream and then worked very hard to police its boundaries and to push away impulses we might call illiberal. Impulses towards nationalism, impulses towards racial exclusion, and that was something that conservatives had to work at over time, but they did get there, to making the argument that conservatism was essentially a universalistic, idea-based creed that anyone could join. And so I think looking back, we see a tension between what I would call an illiberal conservatism and a liberal conservatism. And this is something my research will be exploring. This is something I ask students to think about, because I think not only is this something we need to rethink in the past, but it's something we need to understand for our present and our future as well. Thank you so much for your time.